The controller slid from my hand, clattering onto the coffee table. Gabriel laughed, his voice low and warm, the sound wrapping around me like a blanket. "You're off tonight, Alex," he teased, leaning back against the couch, his arm brushing mine. His touch lingered, and I froze, my skin tingling where we connected. I glanced at him, the soft glow of the TV casting shadows across his face. His dark eyes met mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt electric. "What is this?" My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough I swore he could hear it. I looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the game. "Just tired," I mumbled, but the excuse sounded hollow, even to me. We'd been friends for years, Gabriel and I. He was the kind of person who made everything feel effortless, who could fill a room with his energy without even trying. I'd always admired that about him, envied it, even. But tonight, something felt different. The way he looked at me, the way his laughter seemed to linger too long, it was as if the air around us had shifted, charged with something I couldn't name. "You've been quiet all night," Gabriel said, his voice softer now. He turned toward me, his knee pressing against mine. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, my fingers twitching against the controller. How do I even begin to explain this? "Just thinking about the future," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Things are going to change after school, you know? It's weird." Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "But not everything has to change, Alex. Some things can stay the same." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I wasn't sure I could decipher. Did he mean us? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I guess," I said, my voice faltering. "But what if we change? What if I change?" Gabriel tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "Why would you say that?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" I shook my head, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and every step I took threatened to send me tumbling into it. "What is happening to me?" Gabriel reached out, his hand resting on my arm. His touch was warm, grounding. "Alex," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Talk to me. Whatever it is, you can tell me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the worry in his eyes. He cared about me, had always cared, but now it felt like more. Like he was holding his breath, waiting for me to say something, do something. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't control. Fear, confusion, longing, they all crashed over me like a wave, leaving me gasping for air. "Gabriel," I whispered, my voice breaking. I think I'm feeling something I shouldn't." His brow furrowed, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his hand tightening on my arm. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my racing heart. "Just say it." "I don't know how to explain it," I said, my voice trembling. "But being around you, it's different now. I feel different, and I don't know what to do about it." There was a long silence, and when I opened my eyes, Gabriel was staring at me, his expression unreadable. My stomach churned, and I braced myself for rejection, for him to pull away and laugh it off, to tell me I was being ridiculous. But he didn't. Instead, he reached up, his fingers brushing my cheek. "Alex," he said, his voice low and rough. "You're not the only one." My breath caught in my throat, and I stared at him, unable to speak. What did he just say? My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, but before I could respond, Gabriel leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The world seemed to stop, the room fading away until it was just the two of us. His kiss was soft, tentative, as if he was afraid I'd pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, my hands gripping his shirt as the weight of everything I'd been feeling crashed over me. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. Gabriel looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Alex," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been feeling it too. For a while now." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "This is real. This is happening." "Gabriel," I said, my voice shaking. "What does this mean? For us?" He hesitated, his hand still resting on my cheek. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt a wave of emotion I couldn't control. My eyes stung with tears, and I blinked them away, trying to steady myself. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my voice barely audible. Gabriel smiled, a soft, gentle smile that made my heart ache. "Then we'll figure it out," he said, his thumb brushing my cheek. "Together." I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. He was right, we'd figure it out. But for now, I let myself lean into him, his arms wrapping around me as the weight of everything we'd just shared settled between us. Our usual hangout had taken a turn I never could have predicted, and as I rested my head against his chest, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. The days after that night felt surreal. like I was walking through a dream where the edges of reality blurred just enough to make everything feel possible. Gabriel and I hadn't talked about it directly since then, but the air between us was different, charged, fragile, and tender all at once. We still hung out as usual, but now there was this unspoken thing, this quiet understanding that something had shifted. It was a Friday evening, and we were at his place, sprawled on the couch. The TV was on, but neither of us was really paying attention. Gabriel was scrolling through his phone, and I was pretending to watch the show, though my thoughts were elsewhere. My eyes kept drifting to him. The way his dark eyes flickered with the light from the screen, the way his lips curved faintly when something amused him. I'd always noticed these things about him, but now they felt like they belonged to me in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Alex," Gabriel said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but it startled me all the same. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my heart was already pounding. He set his phone down and turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk about it?" My throat tightened. That one word carried so much weight, and I knew exactly what he meant. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready. Gabriel shifted on the couch, turning to face me fully. His dark eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I felt like he could see everything I was trying to hide. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, "about what happened. About us." I swallowed hard. "Us." That word felt even heavier. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want things to be weird between us," he continued, his tone sincere. "But I also don't want to pretend like it didn't happen. Like I don't feel something." I nodded again, my chest tightening. "I don't know what it means," I confessed, my voice trembling. "I've never felt like this before. About anyone. And it's scary." Gabriel reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I realized how much I'd been craving it without even knowing. "It's scary for me too," he said quietly. "But I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's real." His words hit me like a wave, washing over me and pulling me under. Real. I'd spent so much time trying to ignore what I was feeling, trying to convince myself it was just confusion or a passing phase. But hearing him say it, it made it impossible to deny. "Do you really think we can do this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Without messing everything up?" Gabriel smiled, his expression warm and reassuring. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to try, to see where this goes." I stared at him, my mind racing. Everything about this felt so uncertain, so fragile, but at the same time, it felt right. Like something I wouldn't walk away from. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Let's try." Gabriel's smile widened, and he squeezed my hand. "Together," he said, his voice firm. The word hung in the air between us, a promise and a challenge all at once. I felt a surge of emotion, fear, excitement, and something else I couldn't quite name. Before I could overthink it, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his in a tentative, almost questioning kiss. He responded immediately, his hand cupping the back of my neck as he deepened the kiss. It was different from the first one, slower, more deliberate, as if we were both trying to figure out what this meant for us. His lips were warm and insistent against mine, and I felt myself sinking into it, letting go of the fear and uncertainty that had been holding me back. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Gabriel's dark eyes were full of something I couldn't quite place. Affection, maybe, or longing. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "What if we're not?" I asked, my voice trembling. Gabriel's expression softened, and he pulled me into a tight hug. "Then we'll figure it out," he murmured into my hair. "We always do." I let myself relax into his embrace, the warmth of his body grounding me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. Like no matter what happened, we'd find a way through it. We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, the weight of everything unspoken settling between us. Eventually, Gabriel pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Do you want to stay the night?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated, my heart racing. Staying the night felt like crossing a line, one I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want this moment to end. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Gabriel smiled, and it was the most genuine smile I'd ever seen on him. "Okay," he said, standing and offering me his hand. I took it, letting him pull me to my feet. His fingers intertwined with mine, and he led me down the hallway to his room. The air between us was charged, and I could feel my pulse racing with every step. When we reached his room, he turned to face me, his dark eyes full of questions. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. But I knew I wanted to be here, with him, in this moment. I'm sure, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Gabriel smiled, and then he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. This kiss was different, slower, deeper, like he was trying to tell me something without words. I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as the tension between us reached a breaking point. And then, just as things were about to escalate, he pulled back, his breath ragged. "We can take this slow," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "As slow as you need." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What if I don't want to take it slow?" I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Gabriel's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, his hands. Gabriel's hands stayed on my hips, his grip firm but not tight, as if he was anchoring me to the moment. His dark eyes held mine, unblinking, and I could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging between us. My heart was still racing, but there was a new kind of calm in our closeness, something that made the chaos in my head quiet down for a moment. "Together," I repeated, the words sounding heavier than I expected. It wasn't just a reassurance, it was a promise, and it scared me almost as much as it thrilled me. Gabriel nodded, his lips curving into that soft smile I'd seen so many times before, but this time it felt different. There was something in it that made my stomach twist in the best way. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and steady. "Together." He stepped back just enough to give me space, but his hands didn't leave my hips, and I didn't want them to. I could feel the warmth of his touch through the fabric of my shirt, and it was like a current running through me, pulling me closer to him even when he wasn't moving. "You know," he said, his tone light but laced with something deeper. "I've been thinking about this for a while now. About us." My breath hitched. "How long is a while?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel chuckled, a low sound that made my skin prickle. "Longer than I should probably admit," he said, his thumb brushing against my hip bone in a way that made me shiver. But I didn't want to mess things up. "You're important to me, Alex. More than anyone." I swallowed hard, the words settling in my chest like something solid. "You're important to me too," I said, the admission coming out softer than I meant it to. I didn't know it could be like this." "Neither did I," he admitted, his gaze flickering down to my lips for a split second before meeting my eyes again. "But I'm glad it is." There was a pause, a moment where neither of us spoke, and the air between us felt thick with something I couldn't name. Gabriel's hands shifted slightly, his fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt, and I found myself leaning into him without even thinking about it. "Do you?" I started, but he cut me off with a shake of his head. "Don't overthink it," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost a rumble. "Just be here with me." I nodded, my throat tight, and then he was leaning in again, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, like he was trying to memorize the way I felt. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him like he was the only thing keeping me steady, and when he deepened the kiss, I let myself fall into it completely. There was no hesitation this time, no pullback. It was just us, the two of us, navigating something new and overwhelming and beautiful. His hands moved from my hips to my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the way his heart was pounding as fast as mine was. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Gabriel rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "Okay," he asked, his voice rough but soft. "Yeah," I said, my voice just as unsteady. "More than okay." He smiled, that same soft smile that was starting to feel like it belonged only to me, and then he kissed me again, quick and sweet this time. "Good," he said, pulling back just enough to look at me. "Because I'm not ready to let this go yet." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I let my hands trail down his arms, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way he seemed to hold himself back even as he leaned into me. It was like he was waiting for something, some kind of sign from me, and I realized with a start that I was doing the same. "Gabriel," I said, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," he asked, his eyes searching mine. I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "But I want to keep doing it. With you." Gabriel's expression softened, and he brushed a strand of hair out of my face, his fingers lingering against my skin. "We'll figure it out," he said again, his voice steady and sure. "One step at a time." I nodded, my heart swelling with something I couldn't name, and then he was kissing me again, and the world outside of this moment ceased to exist. It was just us, our breath mingling, our bodies pressed together, and the sound of our hearts beating in tandem. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt found that I woke up to the soft hum of Gabriel's breathing, his arm draped loosely over my waist. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. For a moment, I just lay there, savoring the weight of his body against mine, the way his fingers curled instinctively into the fabric of my shirt. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a dream I wasn't sure I deserved. "Morning," Gabriel murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He shifted slightly, his nose brushing against the back of my neck, and I felt a shiver ripple through me. "Morning," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. My heart was already racing, and I wasn't sure if it was from the proximity or the reality of what we'd been doing, what we confessed to each other last night. Gabriel's hand slid up my side, his touch tentative, as if he were testing the waters. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his breath warm against my skin. I swallowed, my throat dry. "I don't know," I admitted. "Good. Confused. Scared. All of the above." He chuckled softly, the sound vibrating through his chest and into mine. "Yeah, that sounds about right." His fingers traced idle patterns on my hip, and I could feel the heat of his palm through the thin fabric of my shirt. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." I turned my head slightly to look at him, and our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something intense and unguarded, that made my breath catch. "Me too," I said quietly. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then, slowly, Gabriel leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, almost hesitant. It was different from the ones we'd shared last night, less urgent, more searching, and it sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. I didn't pull away. Instead, I pressed into him, my hand finding its way to his cheek, my fingers splaying against the stubble there. His lips parted against mine, and I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite place. Desire, yes, but also something deeper, something that made my chest ache. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark, almost unreadable. "Alex," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for." "I mean that." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I want this. I want you." His eyes softened, and he brushed a thumb across my lower lip, sending a shiver down my spine. "Okay," he said simply, and then he was kissing me again, this time with more certainty, more intent. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as his hand slid under my shirt, his palm warm against my skin. His touch was electric, sending sparks of pleasure racing through my body, and I couldn't help but gasp against his mouth. "Gabriel," I breathed, my voice trembling. I don't know." "Shoo," he murmured, his lips trailing along my jawline, down my neck. "It's okay. We'll figure it out. Together." His words sent a wave of warmth through me, and I felt some of the tension in my body melt away. He was right. We'd figure it out, one step at a time. His hand moved lower, slipping beneath the waistband of my pants, and I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost reverent. I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could feel it. "Yes," I whispered, my voice shaky. "More than okay." He smiled against my skin, his lips brushing against the hollow of my throat, and then his hand was moving, his touch firm but gentle, and I felt my body respond almost instantly. My fingers tightened in his hair, and I let out a breathless moan, my hips arching into his touch. "Gabriel," I gasped, my voice breaking. But he cut me off with another kiss, his mouth claiming mine with a possessiveness that sent a thrill through me. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated, as if he were mapping out every inch of my body, learning what made me tick. And then, suddenly, he pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "Alex," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to tell me if this is too much. If you're not ready." I cut him off with a kiss, my hands gripping his shoulders as I pulled him on top of me. "I'm ready," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. "I want this. I want you." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine, and then he nodded, his expression softening. "Okay," he said quietly, his hand moving to the hem of my shirt. "But if you change your mind, you tell me. Promise." I nodded, my breath catching as he tugged my shirt over my head, his eyes roaming over my bare chest with a hunger that made my skin burn. "I promise," I whispered. He was about to say something else when his phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet of the room. He glanced at it, frowning, but didn't move to answer it. "You should get that," I said, my voice hoarse. "It might be important." He hesitated, then shook his head, his eyes never leaving mine. "It can wait," he said firmly, leaning down to kiss me again. "Right now, the only thing that's important is you." And then his mouth was on mine again, and the world outside of this room ceased to exist. It was just us, our breath mingling, our bodies pressed together, and the sound of our hearts beating in tandem. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt found. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft streaks across Gabriel's face as he slept. His arm was still draped over me, heavy and warm, grounding me in the moment. I lay there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, my own heart beating in rhythm with his. This is real, I thought, the realization both comforting and terrifying. I had never been this close to someone, not just physically, but emotionally. It felt like we had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed, and now there was no going back. Gabriel stirred, his dark eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he looked disoriented, but then his gaze found mine, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow, his free hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in a long time," I admitted, my cheeks warming under his scrutiny. His smile deepened, and he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tender, and full of unspoken promises. "Good," he said when he pulled away, his eyes locking with mine. "Because I want you to know, this isn't just a fling for me, Alex. You're not just someone I'm messing around with. You're important to me." His words hit me like a wave, washing over me and leaving me breathless. Important. The word echoed in my mind, filling the spaces I hadn't even realized were empty. I wanted to say something, to tell him that he meant just as much to me, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached up, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and kissed him again. It was a kiss full of all the things I couldn't say, my fears, my hopes, my growing affection for him. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "We don't have to rush anything," he said softly. "We can take this as slow as you need. I want you to know that I'm serious about this. About us." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "And I feel the same way. It's a lot to process, you know?" He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Yeah, I get it. It's a lot for me too. But I think we're worth it, don't you?" I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, and felt something settle inside me. "Yeah," I said, my voice steadier now. "We're worth it." We lay there for a while, just talking and laughing, the tension from the night before melting away. It felt normal in a way I hadn't expected. Like this was just another morning, except now there was a new layer to our relationship, something deeper and more intimate. And as strange as it was, it felt right. Eventually, Gabriel's stomach growled loudly, breaking the quiet of the room. He laughed, sitting up and stretching. "Guess we should think about breakfast, huh?" I nodded, reluctantly sitting up as well. "Yeah, I could eat." He stood, offering me his hand, and I took it, letting him pull me to my feet. His hand lingered in mine for a moment before he let go, and I couldn't help but smile at the way his touch still sent a shiver down my spine. We made our way to the kitchen, Gabriel pulling out ingredients while I leaned against the counter, watching him. He moved with a confidence that was both familiar and new, and I found myself captivated by the way his muscles shifted under his shirt as he worked. "You just gonna stand there and stare? Or are you gonna help?" he teased, glancing over his shoulder at me. I laughed, pushing off the counter and joining him. "What do you need me to do?" "Can you chop these?" he asked, handing me a knife and a cutting board with a few vegetables on it. I nodded, getting to work while he busied himself with the stove. It was domestic, in a way I hadn't expected. Cooking together, laughing, stealing glances when the other wasn't looking. It felt like we were building something, piece by piece, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. As we sat down to eat, Gabriel reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "So, what do you want to do today?" he asked, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. I shrugged, feeling a warmth spread through me at his touch. "I don't know. I don't really have any plans." He smiled, his eyes lighting up with an idea. "How about we just spend the day together? No pressure, no expectations. Just us." I felt a flutter in my chest at the thought, and I nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." We spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon in a comfortable rhythm, alternating between talking and silence, touches and glances. It felt like we were finding our footing, navigating this new space we had created for ourselves. And as the day wore on, I found myself relaxing more and more, letting myself sink into the feeling of being with him. At one point, we ended up on the couch, Gabriel's arm around my shoulders as we watched a movie. I found myself leaning into him, my head resting on his shoulder, his fingers gently stroking my arm. It was intimate, in a way that felt natural, like this was where I was meant to be. The movie was just background noise as I focused on the steady rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his body against mine. I felt safe. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't overthinking everything. I was just present. Eventually, the credits rolled and Gabriel shifted, turning to face me. "Hey," he said softly, his hand cupping my cheek. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was slow and sweet, full of all the things we hadn't said yet. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I meant what I said earlier," he murmured. "This is real for me, Alex. You're real for me." My heart swelled at his words, and I reached up, my hand resting on his. You're real for me too, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside me. He smiled, and then his lips were on mine again, the kiss deepening as he pulled me closer. His hands wandered, exploring the curves of my body with a gentleness that made my breath catch. I felt a heat building inside me, a desire that was both familiar and new. I wanted this. I wanted him. Gabriel, I breathed, my voice trembling as I pulled back slightly. He looked at me, his dark eyes full of concern. What is it? Are you okay? I don't know what to say. How do you like this story?